Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Tonight we have a special treat for you. An Egyptologist, in other words, a historian who's been studying one of the oldest and longest lasting civilizations on Earth, spanning 3,000 years. Christian Casey from New York.
Hi, everyone.
Hmm.
And
What
hi,
can you
Carlos.
tell
I see
us
you
about?
now.
All right. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Casey.
So I just finished a PhD at Brown University. I was there for a while working on that. I work specifically on Egyptian language and then more specifically on handwritten Egyptian scripts. So, if you've seen Egyptian hieroglyphs, obviously they're very complicated. You can imagine they're not very convenient for the everyday purposes that most people use writing for. So Egyptian very early started developing these handwritten scripts that started off looking more or less just like drawings of hieroglyphs. But then over the thousands of years of Egyptian history, they gradually became more and more abbreviated so that they no longer resemble hieroglyphs anymore. And then different glyphs sort of got combined together into single signs, and then those signs evolved. So you have this really complex process of things like splitting and merging and evolving according to all sorts of different factors, like everything from the physics of handwriting to the way the language changed and the way the orthography developed. So it's a really complicated process that's sort of barely understood even today, even though it's been studied for about 200 years now. And my research is it's mostly about collecting data. That's, I think, the most important thing that I do is I try to gather data on Egyptian texts and Egyptian scripts so that we'll have the raw material to do more sophisticated studies of these things. And I live in New York now, so I finished grad school. I started a postdoc at ISAW, which is the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World. It's affiliated with NYU. And yeah, it's a New York institution that kind of specializes in the entire ancient world. So it's a department that specifically studies the ancient world, which sort of sounds very narrow. But then we have people who study everything from ancient Europe to ancient Africa, ancient Asia, all the way to East Asia. So pretty much the entirety of the old world, ancient civilizations.
Yeah. Where to start? Maybe with the beginning of Egyptian civilization itself, which kicked off in the early Bronze Age with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt by Menes, which were previously separate Chalcolithic cultures or nations, if you want to call that. Like, most people don't know about Egypt before the pharaohs, besides what they learned from Stargate. So tell the dear audience about that.
Well, I'll start by telling the audience that Stargate is a good source. So Stargate, I love that movie, and a lot of Egyptologists love that movie. I mean, it's just good fun. And they employed Stuart Tyson Smith, who is an Egyptologist, as their technical consultant. So he inserted all of these kind of like in jokes, like Egyptological in jokes, into that movie. So it's actually really fun to watch as an Egyptologist, but maybe not the best source on pre and proto dynastic Egypt. I'm also probably not the best possible source on pre and proto dynastic Egypt because the things I study tend to be much later than that. But I do know quite a few things about it. So it started as really even going before that. It started as various groups of people, hunter-gatherer people living in the area around the Nile Valley. So before the dawn of Egyptian civilization, the Nile Valley was a different climate than it is now, and than it was, even a few thousand years ago. So at the time, the Nile Valley was a sort of a savanna-like climate. So we have lots of evidence for, settlements that are now out in the desert next to these kind of like, we call them playas. They're basically like dry lake beds or like wadis, which are, dry creek beds essentially. Um, so there's obviously a lot more water, and then there's evidence for like a much broader range of savanna fauna than you would find in the Sahara today. So there were giraffes, there were, I can only think of giraffes. What else was there? There are all sorts of animals that you would associate, lions, of course, and all the things that you would associate with a savanna climate. There were trees and grasses and things. And we find evidence of people living in what is now the desert. And then there was a climate change that happened in the like Eastern Sahara region. And those areas around the Nile Valley dried up. And then the only source of water was the Nile. So that had the effect of sort of just drawing everyone who was living in this area and concentrating them along the Nile River, because that was now the only place anyone could live. And that's sort of taken to be perhaps the impetus for the development of more complex cultures. So you can imagine that if you have various groups of loosely connected hunter-gatherer peoples living in a broad area, and then suddenly something happens in a relatively short historical time frame that brings them all together, they're going to have to change the way they live and behave. And one of the ways of accomplishing that is just like we do today when a lot of people have to live in a small area, we develop social systems that make things work. And that's probably how Egyptian civilization first developed.
So at what point would you say they became two nations, if you want to call it that?
Yeah, I don't really have a problem with the word nations. I think some people might, just because the concept of the nation state and nationalism and those kinds of ideas is normally attributed to like the post Enlightenment world, so like the modern era. But I don't really object to the term. I think it's reasonably accurate. I don't know that there really were necessarily two groups that were nation-like, and I'll just use the term nation from here on out. I don't know that there were two nations. So, and I don't think anybody really does. That
right,
is
because ancient Egyptians make a big deal about Egypt being the two lands, like Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt being united under Menes.
They do, and that's really central to the Egyptian state's representation of itself throughout Egyptian history. So this idea of the two lands is absolutely central. You can find it in just about any royal Egyptian texts. Every king is the lord of the two lands. That's a really constant theme. So given that, and given that we don't really have sort of excellent records, we don't have any historical records, of course, because they hadn't invented writing yet. And then reconstructing political history from archaeology is a more complicated endeavor because we don't actually have their own words. What we do have of their own words is that two nation image, the two lands. So that could be true, and let's for the sake of argument say that it is. And when did that stop being so? I would say around like during the proto-dynastic period. My go-to date is like 3200 BC. We start seeing unification, or this process of unification. And the first really solid evidence of that we have is this famous object called the Narmer palette. And I don't know, can I share?
Yeah, sure.
And show pictures of things? That might be a good idea.
The Narmer palette is supposed to be the oldest recording of a historical event.
Yeah, that might be true. I've never heard it put that way before, but yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it is the event being the unification of the two lands, and then
what I was asking, at what point did they become two distinct lands?
Oh, I really couldn't say, and again, I just don't know. I don't necessarily know that that's accurate. Okay, so can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so this is an armor palette. I just did Google image search, and two sides. On one side, this king figure is wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, and it basically shows him conquering a group of people, or it's a single person, but a group of people who were like a Delta people. So this symbol here is an amalgamation of different Egyptian symbols. So this looks very much like the hieroglyph that later represents the Delta, and then it's got a human head on this sort of landy type thing. It's got a falcon with an adze pulling at the guy's nose. So that suggests that someone from Upper Egypt has conquered the people of Lower Egypt. And then this posture of the king where he's, wearing the crown, he's holding a mace up, he's about to strike a defeated enemy with it. That's a common Egyptian symbol that persists throughout Egyptian history. And this is one of the first instances of it, maybe the first. So that's kind of where we get those concepts from, that this was, where'd my thing go? Stop sharing. How do I stop sharing my screen?
Just one quick question though: is he the same as the Scorpion King, or is that an altogether different beast?
No, it's a different person. Can you guys see me again now?
Yeah.
Okay. That's a different person. So there is a grave attributed to Scorpion, and then there's various objects that have the Scorpion name on them. That's a different name from the Narmer name. Really, at this time, the hieroglyphs are a bit shaky. So like Narmer, we have just 2 hieroglyphs that are phonetically Narmer. And there are reasons that people think it's that, but it's not really certain. Scorpion is kind of just a picture of a scorpion. So like that's his name, we guess.
And
really, when
his other name is Menes, as I said.
Well,
that's
so
the mythological name they gave him.
Yeah, that's like a semi-mythological name. And the idea that Narmer is Menes, to me, I always equate it with saying that like Uncle Sam is George Washington, or maybe it's the other way. Narmer is Menes. It's like saying that George Washington is Uncle Sam. So Narmer, we have actual historical evidence for. Menes is a semi-mythical like founder figure that equating him with an actual person just doesn't really make any sense necessarily, because it's not really necessary. It's like I said, like, saying that Uncle Sam is George Washington, it's like, what does that really even mean? Like, he represents him, but he has certain different attributes. So he's like a sort of symbolic version of him.
I always kind of thought of it was with Alexander Sikander or Genghis Khan and Temujin.
Well, I mean, Genghis Khan is more of a title than it is a name.
That's what I figured. Menes might have been a title.
Yeah, my advisor thinks that Menes is it's just many in Egyptian, and he thinks it's the Memphite. So the idea is that there was this Upper Egyptian king who conquered Lower Egypt and moved the capital to Memphis. Egypt is kind of neatly divided into like the valley, this long strip of river, and then the delta, where the river fans out, and you kind of have this like 2-dimensional area of land. And Memphis, which is basically modern Cairo, is right between the two of them. So to call him the Memphite is like saying, oh, he's the guy who brought everything together and established this new central point. So it could mean that. I don't know whether that's true or not, but really he's symbolic.
With Uncle Sam, the real person that Uncle Sam is based off of, if you want to say that, would be a guy named Samuel Wilson.
I always figured it was Washington, Franklin, and Jefferson put together.
Nah, it was just the namesake and stuff like that came from a guy named Samuel Wilson, who he owned like a meat packing factory, and he happened to just have the look that the drawers were going for, and he just sort of became the namesake.
I want you.
So he was just kind of an image. He was the image that they wanted for that poster. Yeah. And and I think that's a good way to think of Menes too. He is the kind of archetypal first unifying king. Whether that equates to a real person or not, it kind of doesn't really matter at that point, because he's a symbol. Sam Wilson being a real person who owned a butcher shop, he was a meat packer or whatever he was. It doesn't really.
Yeah,
that's not really
he owned
part
a
of
packing factory.
Kind of like with King Arthur and the various other kings he was based on.
Yeah.
All right. Most people are at least familiar with the Three Kingdoms period, so let's start with the Old Kingdom. This would be the golden age of Egyptian civilization, which most notably brought about the pyramids and the Sphinx, as well as bigger cities, such as the capital of the period, which was Memphis. Tell us about that.
Well, so it's kind of a big topic. Um, so the Old Kingdom was really the first, like, big flowering of Egyptian civilization. The a golden age, I suppose you would consider it a golden age. Um, you know, Egypt was around for a really long time. Things changed over that time. Anytime you have a period of strong central government, you're going to see things in the historical record that you won't see at other times. So you're going to see like big public works and evidence for highly concentrated wealth, because of course if there's a central kingdom, they're taxing the entire country. They have a larger pool of resources to draw from, so you're going to see bigger and better stuff during that time period. And that's basically what we see in the artistic and archaeological record. And that's, the pyramids, obviously that's the time when they arise. So we first see a series of smaller pyramids in the third dynasty, and then there's and at the same time, they're building these mastaba tombs, which are mastaba just means bench, but they're these big square tombs. I'm going to try to do this again because I felt like that worked well. Yeah, okay. So let's pull up some mastabas and see what those look like. And then, yeah, there we go. That's pretty good. Oh, here's a diagram. This is perfect. It's teeny tiny.
Like, basically, if people want to know what a mastaba is, just look at Djoser's pyramid, and then you'll see a bunch of mastabas stacked on top of each other.
Yeah, exactly. So we see these kind of tombs. They're just these big rectangular structures out in the desert that have people buried underneath them. And then Djoser, during the third dynasty, he builds this big mastaba, and he builds 4 mastabas on top of one another in this kind of like wedding cake style. And then they expand it and they widen them and then add 2 more. So you get, I think it's 6, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah. Never actually counted before. But so you get that stacked mastaba style. And this is the first pyramid. If you've heard the name Imhotep, this is where his name comes from. So he was.
This is not to be confused with the antagonist of the Mummy and the Mummy Returns.
Oh, right. Yeah, because there was an Imhotep. Am I back? I'm not sure. Sorry.
Yeah,
I'm okay. Haven't really used Skype in a long time. So Imhotep is Djoser's architect, and he plans this big temple complex. Funerary complex with the stepped pyramid in it, and then there's space around it. So there's these like booths. They're made of stone, but they're made to look like tents. Like if you were to have any kind of big gathering of different peoples, like a fair, essentially, you have all these booth-like things set up around the pyramid. So it's this entire funerary complex for Djoser, and obviously that idea catches on. Sneferu builds 3 pyramids of varying degrees of success. The bent pyramid, they started building it at this really steep angle, and then there we go. And then it started to collapse in on itself, so they had to lower the grade to keep it from collapsing completely. And they added timbers inside the burial chamber to shore it up so that it wouldn't collapse.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, they got a sense of how to build pyramids so that they would stay up.
Then the first one he built was that unfinished one that Napoleon had a portrait of himself in a breakfast dish.
The unfinished one, is that the one with where you can see the core of it?
I think it was one of the first ones. It was the first of the 3 pyramids he had built.
I feel like that. I'm trying to think of it.
Forgot.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the one with the where the core is sort of exposed and it doesn't have triangular sides.
Yeah.
That one was probably originally a like smooth-sided pyramid where the sides have since collapsed, and it's only like the solid stone core that remains, which is super interesting because it shows us what's at the inside of these pyramids. I have a little thing. Who is this?
Oh, that's
Is this Sam?
Yes, the Uncle Sam guy.
There he is.
Yeah, I figured that's where they hit. Like I looked it up because it got actually like little. That's sort of the time period I'm into when it comes to it, and you know, basically he was just a meat packer that he happened to have a look and stuff.
Who is the Statue of Liberty's model?
Oh, it was the painter's mother, I believe.
Anyway, go on.
Yeah, you go on. It's sort of sidetracking.
So pyramids. This idea becomes really popular of building pyramids, and then several successive kings do it. It's obviously very expensive and sort of taxes the resources of the country. But the way that they were able to do it, so the king had command of this entire country and could requisition wealth, normally in the form of grain. So the state would tax farmers in the form of grain, and then redistribute the grain as payment. And then they would also require labor from people. So that every year the Nile would flood all the fields and fertilize them, and that's why Egypt was so productive agriculturally. But during that time when the fields were flooded, there wasn't necessarily much for the farmers to be doing because their fields were just underwater. So in exchange for paying fewer taxes, they could go work on a state project. And that's where most of the labor for building the pyramids came from. So you can imagine it in one sense as like a very expensive operation for the state to promote, but then you can also sort of imagine that they were quite sophisticated at running their country, and they probably realized that there was great social and economic value in this method of redistributing wealth by putting people to work. I kind of think of it like the WPA or something like that, where the pyramid is I don't want to say pointless, but not necessarily of immediate practical value to most people. But by hiring people to work on it, the state is sort of stimulating the economy through doing that. So it probably did have that effect to some degree. But then the other side of that is that it might have just bankrupted the government. So we see pyramids starting in the third dynasty, fourth dynasty, fifth dynasty, and then in the sixth dynasty, they kind of start to die out, and then the old kingdom ends. So it could be a coincidence or it could be causal. We don't really know, but perhaps that had an effect.
Right. So we all know
you could say it was a giant pyramid scheme.
You could say that.
Like we all know by now that slaves did not build the pyramids or aliens. Khufu is mainly the most recognizable figure in this period, since the biggest pyramid of all was built in his name, but it was Djoser whose pyramid was the first one commissioned by Imhotep. Contrary to Herodotus' quote-unquote journalism, the old pharaohs were not tyrants. They just had huge egos. Like, as the pharaoh that began the Old Kingdom, what can you tell us about Djoser's life and what life was like in his time?
Oh, I have no idea what Djoser's life was like. I don't know whether anyone does. I don't think we have such detailed records from that time period. Yeah, I don't know anything about Djoser's life. I don't know whether he was a tyrant. He was obviously like a capable political leader at the very least, because he was able to see this project through. I think Herodotus says that Snefru was a benevolent king, and that Khufu was a monster.
Khufu and Khafre were tyrants.
And they might have been.
Both,
I mean, we really don't know.
They were politicians, so yeah, they would be.
Yeah, I mean, there are good kings and there are bad kings. I don't
Yeah,
And I don't know if we know enough about them to really say what their personalities were like. Like
Khufu
Herodotus
was
is basing this on couple couple thousand years of hearsay at
yeah
that point.
like Khufu was more like a gold obsessed megalomaniac in the land of the pharaohs. If you've ever watched that,
I have not. No. Is that a movie?
yeah, it's one of
No.
the ones of the 50s anyway.
Land of
What,
the
what
Pharaohs
was,
is what it's called.
huh?
Land of the Pharaohs.
Yeah,
Okay, I'll check it out.
like what our second part of my question was what life was like in general during his time.
Um.
Brutal,
Well, most
nice
people
and short.
it would have been shorter, certainly. Not as much shorter as we're often led to believe. So, you know, the low life expectancy is partially attributable to infant mortality, and partially attributable to just uh, medicine and nutrition and all of those things. A member of the royal court would have had a similar life expectancy to modern people, and they would have had, similar nutrition and things like that. Um, what was life like? That's a really big question. I'm not sure how to narrow it down because so
Like for the individual person, like what the average person lived like.
they probably lived in small mud brick houses on slightly higher ground in the floodplain. So when it flooded every year, their where their houses were, the land that their houses were on, the land that their houses was on. I'm not sure if that's right. Anyway, so that would be slightly above the high water mark of the flood, and then they were surrounded by fields, and their fields or the fields that they worked, and they would have spent most of their time farming. So this is intensive agriculture, and it's irrigation agriculture. So there's all sorts of things to do with clearing ditches and channels, and closing and opening dikes, and weeding fields, plowing fields, all the things that farmers do that would have made up most people's lives. Um, and again, this is we're talking about a highly stratified society where there were a few people at the top who probably had access to a lot of luxury and nutrition and a lot of the good things, and then a lot of people who were at the bottom and just worked in their fields and paid their taxes, and um, yeah, I don't
Okay,
think it would have been an unhappy life.
I suppose. Like building the pyramids was a job that you wanted basically. Like you were fed well, you got more food than anybody else. Everybody waited on you, and like the labor is hard, but it was kind of worth it, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think there were other things that went into it too. Like it's very clear that there was a sense of civic pride associated with working on the pyramids. Um, Probably a sense of belonging. That you can read about these things even in recent U.S. history when we used to build, um, you know, worthwhile public architecture and things. People would be very proud to have contributed to
Like
some
the Statue of
communal
Liberty.
project, like the Statue of Liberty, or like any city hall that was built more than 50 years ago that doesn't
And,
look like
and you
shit.
said Lady Liberty was this painter's daughter.
Like the sculptor, not his daughter, his mother.
Oh, his mother.
Yeah, the French sculptor's mother that he based it off of.
Oh, interesting.
So it's always interesting to know how there's always inspirations that go into everything.
hmm Like
Yeah.
let's let's discuss the Middle Kingdom, which followed the anarchy of the intermediate phase, which followed the end of the Old Kingdom and began with the end of the Neo-Sumerian era, like coincided with that. This period in Egypt could be compared to the classical age of Greece, which was the high point for art and literature. And the capital of this period was Thebes, if I remember, or was it still Memphis?
So the capital during the Middle Kingdom was Thebes at first. So the unification during the Middle Kingdom came from Theban rulers, like local Theban rulers who reunited the country. And then the capital moved to a place called Ichtawi, which it's near Memphis. It's like south and west of Memphis. It's sort of between, like if you look at a map of Egypt, there's the Nile as this long strip running through it. Actually, I'll just show you. I don't know why I keep forgetting that I can do this. Let's see. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Each Tawi. Hey, there we go. Well, these maps are terrible. Does this even show it? Okay, so
it was near Memphis.
It was near Memphis, and it's kind of neat. So there's the Fayum is to the west of the Nile, and then there's a part of a branch of the river that connects the two. So it was sort of on the way to the Fayum, essentially.
I remember I was actually talking to my friend here, Carlos, about it, where we always have a tendency to call the desert, one of the deserts in there, the Sahara Desert, when Sahara itself already means desert.
Yeah, it's the Arabic word for desert.
Desert.
So I always found that funny. You could just say the Sahara and leave it at it. You don't have to add desert to it.
Yeah, it's a bit redundant, I suppose.
Yeah. Although I guess you could probably, I don't know if like there's an English example of that, but I imagine they probably exist. Language is funny like that.
Yeah, it is.
What's the most interesting you can tell us about this period?
The most interesting thing about the Middle Kingdom, it definitely was kind of a high point of literature. The language of the Middle Kingdom became the classical language of Egypt in the way that, Latin was the classical language of medieval Europe, even though no one really spoke it on a day-to-day basis. They still wrote in that. Similarly, in modern Arabic-speaking countries, the standard classical Arabic is this kind of like elite literary language, but it's not what people speak day to day, and it's not even necessarily mutually intelligible anymore. So that's kind of interesting. The language from this period became the standard. What else about it? There's this crazy story. I can't remember the details, but there's a story about like an expedition to the eastern desert, and like an antelope gave birth on a stone, and it was like a prophecy that Amenemhat was going to be king, and then the first king of the 12th dynasty is called Amenemhat. So like maybe that's the kind of the story of how he became king. It's like this desert creature giving birth on a rock. I'm sure there's more to the story than that, because that doesn't really make any sense.
Probably crazier than Narmer being taken away by a hippo or something.
Yeah, I just remember it seeming kind of random. I've heard the story a few times, and I never really remember the details because it just doesn't. It's like it's not clear how the details contribute to the story. So yeah, but there's something like that. I'm trying to think if there's anything else cool. I'm sure there's something really cool that happens in the Middle Kingdom that's just not occurring to me at the moment. But
as long as we all remember that, Christians got the story of Jesus from Horus, then we're all good.
and Osiris.
I forgot where that comes from. The whole zeitgeist.
It's from Zeitgeist, yeah.
Yeah.
It's in that awful movie Zeitgeist, but it was
it's a bunch of figures, also Mithras and Krishna and Dionysius and Attis, even though he has almost no comparisons with any of them.
Yeah, it really doesn't work. I think there's some like 19th century author that originally claimed that there was this connection between Jesus and Horus or Jesus and Osiris. And there are, there are points of alignment, of course. These are you can take two totally disconnected cultures and look at their folktales, and you'll find points of alignment because people tend to tell stories that are appealing for the same reasons.
They also like to say that the early Christians compared Isis with the Virgin Mary.
So that part is true. So the cult of Isis was very
It was,
widespread in the
it was
ancient Mediterranean.
it was massively popular in Rome.
Right. Um, and then, of course, the Jesus and the Virgin Mary kind of uh, supplant that very neatly, or just supplant them directly as figures of mother and child. And you can see it in the artistic record. You see, this very common image of the Isis lactans image of Isis with Horus on her lap, and she's breastfeeding him. And then you see the exact same image with the Virgin Mary. And then if you look at medieval art that depicts the Virgin Mary, she'll sometimes have a sort of crescent moon on her head, which very clearly imitates the the horned sun disk that Isis often has on her head.
Yeah.
So there are connections there, but they're more symbolic or artistic than anything else. People recognize the similarity in these stories or in these figures, and so kind of like used known imagery to express that. It's not necessarily the same as someone just fitting two stories together, or just totally cribbing a story from one culture and making it their own with by just like when you copy your friend's homework,
There's a
you
way
just
of
change it a little bit.
the early Egyptian Christians warming up to it.
Yeah, and I think
Similar
that's certainly true.
to what the Greeks did with Apollo and them.
Yeah, and we can see that in the historical record. There are certainly ways in which the Egyptian religion influenced Egyptian Christianity when it arrived. It's a really complicated and really interesting story, because we find all these funny things. There's this wonderful text where Shenouda, who was the abbot of the White Monastery during the 3rd and 4th century, I think. And he was just this crazy guy. He's like the patron saint of the Coptic Orthodox Church. So I should be careful what I say about him. I don't want to offend anyone's religious beliefs, but he
no pulling any punches here.
He's an interesting guy. So we have a biography of him written in Coptic by his successor, Beza, and he tells all these stories of Shenouda. He always seems to be beating someone up. Like there's all of these, episodic stories about him as a child, and he's always fighting people for, the flimsiest of reasons. It's like that so-and-so, like Shenouda knew that so-and-so was secretly a heretic, and so decided to start punching him. And even the other people around are like, hey, man, like maybe chill. He seems all right. And then so Shenouda writes this screed against hieroglyphs, where he complains that they're they're corrupting and they're nonsense. They're nothing but pictures of, and then he just lists like 20 animals in his own writing. He's like, they're nothing but pictures of snakes and scorpions and goats and sheep and cat and frogs. And like, it's just the most ridiculous rambling rant. But in that we can see the iconoclasm of early Christianity and kind of where it directed itself, sometimes in these very sort of arbitrary ways, like just, the hieroglyphs, it's just a written language. It doesn't really have, it can't really take a stance on religious matters, but to him it symbolized these things. Can you excuse me for a second? I'm gonna get this cat before she freaks out.
Sure.
All right, sure.
She doesn't like when I'm talking on the phone. It bothers her that I'm not talking to her. All right.
Anyway,
So I guess that comes as an Egyptologist. They worshipped cats, and so do you.
Yeah, kind of. I mean,
they worshipped cats and crocodiles and geese and bulls. Like, what's that all about?
They worked with what they had around them.
Yeah, and well, it's there's really a lot to that. So,
especially snakes.
Snakes are really prominent in Egyptian religion, actually, especially in funerary texts. And they can be symbolic. They can be representative of natural forces. They have personalities. Like a cow, on average, has a different personality than a cat has. And so you could, if you interact with those animals every day, you'd obviously know kind of the general differences between them, and you might use that understanding to explain other natural phenomena. So, Hathor, the cow goddess, is associated with mothers and childbirth and all these sort of like nurturing type things, fertility. And then in her other form as, Sekhmet, Sekhmet, she is a lion and she murders people and she's very violent. And that's kind of like two sides of the same coin. So you can see that when her personality changes, her animal avatar also changes, and that's clearly reflective of her personality. So I think that's part of it, is just kind of having the sense of what a different animal is like and using that as a shorthand to refer to different personality traits.
And there's
And
also,
then,
and they did this thing with the Apis bull, which was meant to represent Apis, and then there's this albino crocodile, which was meant to symbolize Sobek, and kind of like with the Dalai Lama, they look for these like 30 different signs for each of these animals and see which one's the next reincarnated deity, and then they start feeding him stuff and decorating them with robes and jewels and stuff like that.
yeah, and I think there are many cases in history where people do that. I guess the Dalai Lama, I mean, he's a human being, so I don't know if I.
Supposed to be the reincarnation of Buddha, and they would be the reincarnation of these various deities.
Right.
Well, he's a reincarnation of every other Dalai Lama as well.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a thing. I mean, I wonder if in Egypt they actually had sort of that same concept as well, because I know in terms of their afterlife beliefs, they really did take on, the body was very important to them in Egypt. Afterlife rituals.
Yeah, absolutely. So the body, the preserved body, the mummy, it's referred to in Egyptian as like an image. It's referred to in really similar ways to the way they refer to statues or other sorts of images. So there's a much broader idea than that, which is that anything that has an image can act as a sort of vessel for that thing. So I always think of it like if you've seen the Weeping Angels in Doctor Who, where it's like anything that takes the image of an angel becomes an angel. I kind of think of it in those dorky terms. So it would apply to everything from, the desiccated corpse of a deceased person could be the image for their soul to inhabit, as could a picture of them carved on their tomb wall, or even their name. And we see it in funerary texts where they write the names of malevolent entities, and they every Egyptian word is like written phonetically with a hieroglyph after it that symbolizes the thing itself. So if you have like an evil snake figure, like a pope, you'll have this like a snake at the end of his name because he's a snake, and they'll cross that out or draw little knives through it to kind of like spiritually disable that image. And that really applies to just about anything that holds a person's image. Mummies are one subset of that broader category of things.
All right, and considering the fact, back to the Middle Kingdom, like considering the fact that that was when waves of Asiatic Semites were coming into Egypt, as reported by Numhotep III, this would be the period in which the figure we know as Joseph lived, correct? Like that would fit the chronology, and I think the main reason we don't find him in the records is because as a Semite, he was connected with the Hyksos, which we'll discuss soon, and the pharaoh who did not know Joseph, Ahmose I, tried to erase the memory of Asiatic rule in Egypt when he and other native Egyptians from Thebes drove them out.
Okay, there's a lot going on there. So we definitely see evidence for interaction with, people from the Levant, essentially from that region. The region that is today Israel, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, all of those areas. Kind of together, we see a lot of contact with that region from the very beginning of Egyptian history. So we see archaeological evidence for similar like similar objects, like cultural exchange between those two regions. So that's not necessarily a new thing. I think there was certainly a delay in the advent of innovation. So you have a lot of innovation happening in Egypt and then also in Mesopotamia, where you have these very relatively dense populations, and they're building things and inventing things, and those ideas tend to diffuse sort of slowly into places that are less densely populated. So I think there's a delay there, so that around the time of the Middle Kingdom, you start seeing the effect of like these different ideas arriving there. And I think throughout that time you would have had exchange. Certainly trade was definitely going on. Tends to be downplayed in Egyptology, which is one of my big soapboxes, is that like no group of human beings has ever not engaged in trade. So the fact that we don't really see it or talk about it in ancient Egypt is just sort of nonsensical. So there's no question that the Egyptians would have been interacting and trading with people from the Levant throughout Egyptian history. And then there's a kind of a wave or an influx of Semitic peoples into the Eastern Delta. And then those people eventually, rose to power in that region. And then during the Second Intermediate Period, when there wasn't a centralized state, those people were very prominent in that region. And then the propaganda of the reunification for the New Kingdom was centered around expelling these non-Egyptian people. I don't know if Ahmose was the pharaoh who did not know Joseph, like from the Bible. I don't
like it kind of fits because he he drove out the Semites, the Hyksos, and the Semites that remained were enslaved, so they would not rise up again.
I think there's probably a lot more to the story than that. I just think there's more. There's so much time and so many people that I would see that as, so the biblical version of the story could be a sort of semi-legendary retelling of those events.
Right.
The Exodus story obviously has been associated with the expulsion of the Hyksos forever. And it's entirely possible that the Exodus story is itself a semi-legendary retelling of those events. All those things are entirely possible, and they make sense. We don't really have any good evidence to say that that's necessarily the case. It's just sort of a plausible way of seeing things.
We just see circumstantial traces of memory.
Yeah, and that's with always the case with legends. There's this wonderful article, the Torah.com. Let me find it because I read it pretty recently. The Exodus, the history behind the story. I'm going to show this. I really like this article. I found it incredibly convincing. I recommend that all your viewers go read it if they're interested in the possible historical kernel behind the Exodus. I don't necessarily know that it's correct, but it's a really interesting and really convincing argument. I think one of the biggest takeaways from it was that there was this group of people who considered themselves to have been maltreated by the Egyptian state and kind of rose up in revolt against it, and then were eventually forced to flee. And the central theme of the Exodus story is oppression. So, sorry.
We were going to discuss that later on, but
okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, all right. Yeah. So,
I was going to ask you to tell us about these people who had a role in the end of the Middle Kingdom and were driven out before the beginning of the New Kingdom. The
Hyksos.
The Hyksos. Yeah, I call them Hyksos, but it's sounds like better ring to it. But anyway, who were probably connected with the Asiatics who came in around Joseph's supposed time frame? Like, were they Amorites or Amalekites or some other group?
I haven't the faintest idea. I don't know. I really don't know. They were definitely a group of Semitic people, which we can see from linguistic evidence. In terms of specifically which group of people, I mean, there is all sorts of uncertainty about which group of people was where at which time. This is really pre-Israelite history that we're still talking about. So it's anybody's guess, I think.
Okay.
But they were Semitic people, certainly.
Anyway, we can talk about the New Kingdom, aka the Egyptian Empire, which the pharaoh that did not know Joseph, quote unquote, drove out the Hyksos, erased the memory of Asiatic rule, and took Egypt back for the natives, and ushered in Egypt's zenith. Like, New Kingdom would be the time of the most famous pharaohs, Tutmosis III, aka the Napoleon of Egypt, Hatshepsut, Amenhotep III, King Tut, Ramesses II.
I mean, I would say King Tut is more famous now than he probably was in his own original time.
Well, yeah, obviously, because they erased the memory of his father, who was the heretic pharaoh, and they ended up erasing the memory of his entire family, which included King Tut, and that's the reason his tomb was left intact.
Well, I mean,
yeah, I think it was also buried just sort of coincidentally by debris from the entrance to another tomb.
I mean,
yeah, we can just.
It's not like King Tut though had much time to work with to be in that position, because he only was I think he was 18 when he died.
Well, he did bring back the ancient Egyptian religion, which we can talk about in the next interview. But
sure, we can talk about that whenever.
Yeah. I was thinking, since people may not be familiar, were pharaohs like kings? Would that be sort of like a modern way of putting their position, or would that be sort of anachronistic?
No, I think I think king is fine. So we have words for king. They're like the word for king is in the Bible. It's in the New Testament, and there are words there that we translate into English as king, and then those same words are translated into Coptic using the word pharaoh. It's the Coptic word for king is essentially the word pharaoh. It actually the etymology of that word, it comes from an Egyptian phrase "big house," which referred to the royal palace. So you can kind of think of it the way we like metonymically use the phrase "the White House" to refer to the president.
It wasn't a later term that came around later on and earlier. The Egyptian kings were called. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but was the original title for Egyptian king NGR or something without the vowels?
NG
or something. What was the title?
So there's like Nesu.
Oh, that was probably it.
Okay, Nesu. Yeah, that is the standard word for king early on, all the way until in the New Kingdom and later even. And we do see some remnant of that word. Probably my favorite place that we see a remnant of it is in this Coptic word shents, that means royal linen. And that's actually in the Joseph story in the Hebrew. That's it's called shesh, which is like the same Egyptian word borrowed into Hebrew is used to describe Joseph's clothing, which just kind of an interesting connection there. So yeah, that is the earlier word, and we do see remnants of it. It is eventually supplanted by the word pharaoh, even in the Egyptian language. So by the time of the Coptic New Testament, every time we see the word king, it's using the equivalent of the word pharaoh.
I was also wondering, because there is often a misconception that comes up, because the incest that gone on that everyone seems to know about with the pharaoh and their lineup seems to give the impression that incest was just a common thing in Egypt. I think personally that's a misconception, but I was wondering your take. Was that sort of a common thing, or was that just more or less aligned to just the pharaohs to keep the bloodline pure?
Yeah, I think that was a royal practice, and it's throughout history it's been a royal practice um, because of avoiding this dissolution of political power that's um, tied to family relationships. There's a clear, strong motive there, but incest taboos are pretty much universal to human cultures.
A
So
lot of most people don't know this, but before Caesar courted Cleopatra, like Cleopatra was married to her brother Ptolemy.
yeah,
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I believe there's also a lot of theological reason behind that because, correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't pharaohs sort of seen as um, demigods or
Yeah,
descendants of the gods?
yeah, they were the earthly incarnation of the god Horus. Um, and then there are plenty of situations in in Egyptian religion where gods are both brother and sister and husband and wife. You kind of have this like Adam and Eve problem where like um, you know Adam and Eve have children who take wives, and it's like, well, where did they come from? With the first deities of creation, there isn't anyone else for them to marry, and there's this really common theme of um, sort of like sex as the force of creation. That's really uniform throughout the religious stories. So you have like the the first two, the first pair of gods is Shu and Tefnut, male and female, and there's nobody else. So they get married, and then they have two kids, Geb and Newt, who are also brother and sister, and they get married and they have four kids. Um, I don't know that that explanation is really necessary because you also see the same incestuous marriages in royalty throughout history in places where the religion didn't have that element. So it seems like uh, when political power and access to the requisitioning of wealth is at stake, uh, people's priorities tend to realign along those kinds
yeah.
of things.
Some Egyptologists seem to think that Cleopatra had no sexual experience before she met Caesar. So wasn't her marriage to Ptolemy just a political stunt?
I have no idea what they're basing that on. I have no idea. I
Well,
don't.
I mean, you have to also remember a lot of what we know about Cleopatra comes after her lifetime by people
Yeah,
that had an interest in smearing her.
yeah,
Yeah, she is labeled as a sexual predator or
Well, what's funny is that
actress.
people, talk about her alleged sexual infidelity and whatever, but they never talk about Caesar and Mark Antony's, and they had their, they had plenty of um, infidelities in their lifetimes, but that doesn't get talked about.
Well,
well,
no.
it's a pretty classic double standard. And yeah, I mean, it was propagandistic too. The Roman authors definitely wanted to smear Cleopatra and paint her in whatever negative light occurred to them. And especially when you're dealing with like a female ruler, um, sexuality is just a very obvious target for people who want to smear someone. It's what they tend to go for. So I
Yeah,
don't think there's really any mystery why they would say those kinds of things.
yeah. I mean, well, that and it's obviously political bias as well that goes into that. They didn't obviously like her policies or whatever that she did, so that also goes into it.
Yeah, definitely.
And now for what is the divisive factor for people immersed in this period, the Trojan War of Egyptian history and Bible, which is the Exodus. One extreme will tell you that the Exodus happened as recorded in the Old Testament, while the other extreme will insist that it didn't happen at all. It was all quote unquote made up. Like most Egyptologists don't really touch on it, but there are others such as Hoffmeyer, Friedman, Kitchen, Petrovich, Avi, Faust, and several others who accept
Mm.
it or at least sympathetic to the idea. Like, what would be your position on that? And Moses as a historical figure, and what does your gut intuition tell you? And which date would you place it? And which pharaoh would have reigned then? Like Ramesses, Seti, Amenhotep II, Tutmosis III.
Oh gosh, that's very specific. I honestly don't have that specific of feelings about it. I think anybody you ask this question to is going to have their own set of biases. I think the problem with asking a lot of people this is that they would really like to believe that they are not biased. So they will kind of they'll tell themselves that their own biases are either not there or are something else. So, you know, if you talk to someone who has whatever, you know, cultural or religious connection to the Exodus, they will be much more likely to think that it was a historical event. But then if you point out to them that they're potentially biased in that way, they'll insist up and down that that has nothing to do with it. And the same applies on the other side. If you talk to someone who's a emphatic atheist about whether the Exodus ever happened, they'll say, "Oh no, totally impossible, couldn't have happened." You know, and then you could say like, well, maybe there's like a kernel of truth that was later sort of mythologized. Like, no, nonsense. There's no evidence for anything like that. Can't be true. You know, I think both groups of people are untrustworthy. You know, I'm biased myself, so my view on things like that tends to be that I like to trust ancient people. I think that people do make up stories. We love to make up stories, but we also really, really like to tell true stories. And the thing that we like to do the most is to take true stories and make them more exciting.
Right.
So,
like, for example, the number of people that got out of Egypt, I can't remember exactly how many of Moses allegedly would have got out.
Supposed to be 2 million, but that's utterly impossible by any standard. But so
I don't know about utterly impossible, but it's highly unlikely, certainly.
Well, I
Yeah.
mean,
Certainly
like
not
there
likely.
was a joke is like if each of them were standing like in a front line to them, like in a marching order line, the first people that would be getting out, like the first people that would reach the land that they were going to, they would still have people that are just then coming out of Egypt.
Yeah, I haven't done the math on that, but that's definitely a great
then
point.
there's this I don't know if to call it lie or not, but that they combed to Sinai. Like nobody did any such things. Like they found like 5 jeeps from some conflict in the 70s in the Sinai Peninsula under 15 meters of sand. It was dug up recently.
It's interesting. I doubt
Yeah.
anyone's fully combed the Sinai. I mean, it is a large place. It's not, you know, it's not the size of your backyard, but it's not nearly large enough for someone to be lost for 40 years. I mean, you die in that time, or you'd eventually walk somewhere. It's just not.
Well, I mean,
It's not that
I
large a
always
place.
joked about the 40-year thing. I said, I mean, I could start walking there today, and I would still like, and walk and swim there, and I would still probably get there in less than 40 years.
Yeah, you would actually. You know, if there were hypothetically like a land connection from here to there, you could easily walk there in less than a year. I mean,
Right.
the Earth is just not that big.
Right. Even the Bible tells us that they were cursed to wander the land because they were too chicken shit to take back their land from these quote unquote giants.
Well, I mean,
Right.
one thing that people have to remember is that the number 40 is a very
It's a symbolic for a long amount of time.
Yeah, it's like whenever it's used, you're always getting the wonder of like. I mean, it's also funny like this is like even if you're going to take it literally, you have to remember that if Moses and his people existed, they were a nomadic tribe. You don't
Right.
think that they would have stopped and lived somewhere for a while?
Yeah, and
Or
even
they might have lived as nomads in the desert for 40 years, and then later it made it a slightly better story to sort of tweak it so that they were lost, or it just adds drama to frame it that way instead of framing it as, well, there were people living on both sides of them, so they didn't really have access to free land that they could just take, so they lived as nomads for 40 years. That's entirely plausible.
And this would explain their grumbling and complaining all the time, like all the time, because they were just getting out of Egypt and had to live as Bedouins the rest of their lives. And you see throughout the Torah, they're like, "Oh, I wish we were back in Egypt. Life was so much better there."
Yeah.
Which kind of implies that slavery wasn't as bad as popular culture makes it out to be in Egypt, but it was still pretty harsh. But at least they had better food and had better scenery, so to say.
Yeah,
Well,
and slavery in the ancient world was not. We're not talking about conditions like in the American South,
Right.
pre-Civil War. It was not
Or
that degree of dehumanization and misery. Slavery was a position in society that you occupied. Um, it was not an eternal uh, sentence to this sort of like unmitigated misery.
well, I
Um,
mean, the thing is like being a slave in of itself back then was not seen as in of itself a status degradation. Like, because basically everyone in the ancient world considered themselves a slave of someone. Like, even if you were a king or a ruler, you would see yourself as a slave to the gods. So
sure.
it
And
wasn't
that's true
seen as
now also, I would
you
say.
were a slave to someone. It wasn't like trying to think of how to word it correctly. Like what made a bad what made a bad slave or made a degrading slave wasn't being a slave in of itself. It was how you were treated.
Yeah, I
Like
mean, you're definitely lower on the social totem pole if you were a slave than you were if you were a nobleman. And there's no question about that. But
you know, obvious, but I'm like, in some cases it was like for a king, for example, they might, it actually might be a status improvement to say, they're the slave of the gods.
yeah,
In
it
that
could be
sense.
personally
I mean,
beneficial
so I mean,
to exercise.
it's definitely not like what we typically see. Um, like when we, I mean, I think another thing is that besides comparing it to the South, I think another problem is that people compare our modern concept of property ownership to what the ancient people's idea of property ownership is.
Yeah, I don't know if that comparison is anachronistic or accurate. I really don't know. I think that the notion of property ownership in general is a social construct that we so often fail to see as such. Like the only reason anyone owns anything is because everyone else agrees that they own that thing. If everybody just stops believing that, then you no longer own anything at all.
oh,
Um,
anyway, before I forget, what was that article you showed us earlier about the historical core to the
yeah, I'll go back to this real quick. This I personally really like this argument. I found it uh,
because there does seem to
convincing
be
is the wrong word.
huh?
I don't necessarily think that I'm convinced that this is correct, but
Right.
I found it to be a really interesting take on the question because of the way it reframes the oppression narrative. And the oppression narrative is absolutely central to the Exodus story. It is, it's central to satyrs today. That's the central theme is this idea that we were oppressed. And like what does that mean? What does that mean for us as a people that we were once oppressed? How are we obligated to treat our fellow human beings as a result of those conditions? The fact that that narrative is so central, it just really sticks out, and it raises the question of why. The simple explanation is that it's just literally true, and perhaps that's the case. But I think it's worth considering the other possibilities, um, which are not necessarily obvious. But the one that Israel Noel emphasizes in this article is this idea of oppression as a rallying cry. So if you want to lead a revolt against the state, um, and you want to, unify all your supporters, reminding everyone that they have been ill-treated by the people that they have to go fight against is a very effective way of uniting people against their own government. I mean, it's common today. It's the the Southern Trumpian Christian rhetoric is all about this persecution complex, which is totally nonsensical, but it's a very powerful political message. And I think Israel Noel pulls that out of this story and kind of revisits that notion in this different way. And to me, that makes perfect sense. Maybe I grew up in Texas, and I sort of grew up around that persecution mindset. So it's really easy for me to see how a group of people could use that to justify doing what they already wanted to do.
And you also see this type of thing with the left as well.
A persecution complex.
Yeah.
Well, it's the victimhood status thing.
Yeah, victimhood status.
Oh, victimhood status. Yeah, and yeah, you definitely do see that. Sorry, I'm thinking in terms of like academic types, which is like my my point of access to like leftist thinking. You really don't see a lot of persecution complex there, but you do see it in a lot of like social justice movements. The persecution complex, whether accurate or not, is really central. It's a powerful political message, no matter how you slice it. And I think it's possible to understand the oppression at the center of the Exodus story as a similar sort of political rallying cry, whether or not it has any basis in fact. Because with that as a political point of view, it doesn't actually matter whether it has any basis in fact.
Like some will try to point like those who do accept there was a merit to the Exodus, they'll point to that core being connected with the Hyksos, as Josephus suggests, or sometime that Moses was a priest of Akhenaten, as Freud suggests, even though most people don't take him seriously on that. But to me, there does seem to be a lot of circumstantial evidence for it in Egypt during Amenhotep II's reign, but also a lot of circumstantial evidence towards the late date in Canaan, with the sudden arrival of Israel following the collapse of the Bronze Age.
Wait. The sudden arrival of Israel following the collapse of the Bronze Age.
Yeah, the first time we see Israel mentioned in the Mernetta stele,
that's associated. It's at the same time period as late Bronze Age collapse. But the people themselves, there's evidence for their earlier presence in that region. It's the other people of like the Philistines mainly.
Yeah.
That arrive
the sea people.
during. Yeah. The Philistines were probably the Sea People group. The Pelashat.
Well, I mean, as long as we all agree that it was, the Bible was all written by Bronze Age goat herders,
I don't think that's true. I think they would have been fairly urbane. The writers, like the redactors of the Bible, would have been like educated people in a priestly or courtly environment.
But you know what Aaron Ron Nelson says? They were just a bunch of superstitious primitives that didn't know where the sun went at night.
That seems a bit oversimplistic.
Well, I mean, I've never gotten that. Like, what's the problem with, like, I always thought it's a weird hatred.
Brass, we can barely hear you.
All right.
Yeah, I've got a sort of robot voice going on.
I said it's a weird hatred because they don't just hate goat herders, which would be absurd in itself. They have to find a specific time period of goat herders that they hate.
Bronze Age goat herders, like as though there were some like massive difference between Bronze and Iron Age goat herders.
It's anti-Semitic in a way.
Yeah, actually, it isn't necessarily. It's possible that someone could say that without any like racist intent behind it, but man, it is steering really close. It's steering very close to a really awful thing to say.
Well, I mean, what's funny is like
Brassy, keep roboting.
All right. Well, I mean, what's funny about this is like being a goat herder in of itself tells you nothing about your education.
In and out.
I got it. Being a goat herder.
Yeah, being a goat herder in of itself doesn't really say anything about someone's education. We've had presidents that were goat herders. Yeah,
it really doesn't say anything about a person at all. I mean, it doesn't say anything about their moral qualities, their gullibility, it just isn't really an insult unless you're just like the worst kind of classist, and you think that like anybody who is a herdsman is beneath you somehow.
Well, I mean, wasn't it just the idea is like perhaps they just like herding goats. It's a good hobby.
It's a fine way to earn a living.
Yeah, so I'm like, what, I mean, there's plenty of ways that I'd imagine a Gohu to be more intelligent than the average person.
I wouldn't put it past them.
Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely things that you're not going to learn about there, but they're
it's brought into there because that's always a common stereotype.
Anyway, right before we get back to the subject at hand, we just want to confirm this from an Egyptologist. Like, the Library of Alexandria was not burned by Christians, correct? And Hypatia's death had little to no connection with that.
Oh, was Hypatia's death connected with the
With the
burning?
Library
Is it supposed to have been?
That's new atheist propaganda. Like, the big bad Christians rose up and burned the Library of Alexandria, and
Oh man, the Alexandrian Christians were horrible pieces of shit. They were some of the worst human beings that have ever
yeah,
walked
but
the face of the earth.
it's not because they hated learning. It's because they didn't burn down the library, but they
No, it's because they were evil,
yeah,
cynical losers who just wanted to destroy things because they felt that life had mistreated them. And they saw an opportunity in this new religion to assert themselves.
and they mainly scourged Hypatia because she picked the wrong political opponent to ally with.
Yeah, yeah,
Not because she was a scholar or anything like that.
No, I don't think so. So I actually wrote a paper about that. It's dealing with slightly later period, but I looked for the presence of this anti-intellectual mentality that we associate with American Christianity. I looked for that in the arrival of Christianity in Egypt and just didn't find any evidence for it at all. It's just really it was just not the same thing, and equating them is just false. They just are not the same political movement. They have their similarities. I think there's a strong similarity in terms of small-mindedness and cynicism and a victimhood complex and all of these things that sort of dominate American Christian rhetoric. But the anti-intellectualism really is an American phenomenon, and it's a result of a complex constellation of things. Hofstadter's Anti-Intellectualism in American Life is the go-to read about that. And he writes it as an academic. Of course, academics are very critical of anti-intellectualism. It's kind of the other side of the fence from our perspective. But I found a lot in there to sympathize with. So, he talks a lot about the Enlightenment and kind of the rejection of priesthood, the rejection of hereditary nobility, and all of these principles of liberty and meritocracy that were at the center of the American Revolution. And I think all those things are valuable. And the fact that they're connected to a rejection of expertise, I think it's just a bit of a political pendulum.
And just so we're clear, when you say American Christianity, you mean fundagelical Protestant, loud minority, right?
Yeah, I mean exactly this vocal minority of fundamentalist evangelical Christians. That's where anti-intellectualism got its start in these.
Which they would just go away. Like, you see this with like, that could be compared to like these people that were formerly oppressed and end up becoming no better than their former oppressors. That could be compared to new atheists / anti-theists today who mostly grew up in that fundagelical environment and want to take their revenge on the world.
Oh yeah, and I mean you see it a lot. Whenever I talk to New Testament scholars, because that's something I studied in undergrad. I studied classics and I studied the New Testament essentially, like, as an undergrad. So I'm not like a super expert in it or anything, but I'll still talk to New Testament scholars, and I have found in my experience that there are basically two main camps of New Testament scholars. There are like Christian apologists, who I normally get along with pretty well because they tend to be just like nice, normal people, and the anti-Christian atheist who you just can't even have a reasonable conversation with because they are so dogmatic in their hatred of Christianity. And I get it. I mean, I grew up in a Christian environment. I'm not a big fan of Christianity myself. But I just don't share their sort of deep-seated hatred. They're really. I mean, all of these extremist points of view are just exhausting.
Like you're not a fan of historical Christianity and what it's become, not what it originally was.
Um, I
Like
have different feelings.
like
Christianity is such a complex
like
entity.
loving your enemy and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a nice idea. I think the Jesus of um, let's say just ordinary, sane American Christianity, the Jesus that those people believe in is probably the nicest guy in the whole world. He doesn't look at all like the Jesus of the New Testament. The Jesus of the New Testament is a mentally ill hippie who's trying to start a countercultural revolution. He is not a sympathetic figure at all. He's very witty and very clever, and he's a manipulative narcissist. So he's basically a cult leader. I don't admire that figure at all. There's nothing admirable about him. That's not the Jesus that most modern moderate Christians worship, though. So I can respect their uh, I can respect the appeal they see of this figure that they value, even though he looks nothing like the historic person. Um, so yeah, I have complicated feelings about Christianity. Kind of depends more on the Christian than anything else, actually.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we're coming up on almost an hour and a half.
We were going to get back to Moses, who might be, you could also say that about him as well. Like having a Kenite father in law and the fact that Moses was an Egyptian name, meaning born of, probably originally Ra Moses or something. Like, I find it far fetched that he was a purely mythical figure rather than a rogue Egyptian priest who led a few hundred Canaanite Hebrew slaves, which we know the Egyptians owned, and introduced Yahweh worship to them in Midian, whose legend got expanded over time, kind of like Hercules.
Yeah, that's what I think would be the most likely scenario as well.
Yeah. I mean, I'm on the idealistic camp when it comes to Moses, where I don't believe Moses was.
Keep roboting.
All right. I said I take more of the idealistic view, where I think Moses was more, if he existed, he was more or less he wasn't just one person, he was more or less a collaboration of multiple figures that were prominent in that time, like around those time
A,
writing it.
a pastiche, basically.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I mean, it would be basically like if you took, let's say, 5 U.S. presidents, and you took all their characteristics and you all mashed them into one, like, character and just named it, like, like Bob or whatever. And I mean, you could say, in a sense, he existed in the sense that he's based off real characters that did exist. But if you're talking about the character themselves, then no.
Yeah, I think that's plausible too. That's a common storytelling technique, and the most recent example I can think of is the miniseries Chernobyl, where they combine all of the various scientists into the figure of one character who kind of represents their standpoint. Yeah, that's very common, and it's entirely plausible.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. So we are coming up on about the hour and a half mark. We tend to go for like an hour, but this has been a pretty good chat.
Yeah, we might. Our next chat might be longer a little bit, but if you're up for it.
Yeah, we'll talk again later this week, I think.
Yeah.
All right.
So, do you have any, final question or topic that you'd like to go up with Carlos?
No, I was just gonna save it for next week, where we can talk about the gods, various pharaohs, the Bronze Age collapse, the sea people, anything else that comes to mind. So, any projects you're working on in the near future, and tell the dear audience where to find you.
Yeah, I have a website. It's caseyegyptologist.com. There's a contact form there, so if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to ask me anything. Well, really anything at any time, but I kind of prefer that it would pertain to Egyptology in some way. But yeah, go caseyegyptologist.com. Send me some questions. I'm always happy to talk to people about these things.
All right. Well, I'm really glad that we got to have this talk. I think it was actually very interesting. We got to learn a lot about Egypt, and it's going to be fun being able to delve back into this issue and delve into more topics that perhaps our audience doesn't know about.
Yeah, I think it will be great.
All right. So,
any final thoughts, Chris? Mind we call you Chris or just Christian?
I normally go by Christian, but I'm not too picky. No, I think we talked about a lot of interesting things, and I'll see you all again later.
all right.
All right, thanks, guys.
No problem.
Good night.
Okay, well, see you next time. Be sure to like and subscribe as well. We don't ask that much of you. Okay, so